Yum, yum!
Greg here from Pixel Fondue. I've got another video in my MODO, Octane, and V-Ray series. This one deals with transparent materials. So I've actually broken it down into 3 videos because I know how bored you guys get. And it takes a while to get through this stuff. So the first video covers just pure straight transparent surfaces like glass, like clear glass, and also rough or refractively rough surfaces like frosted glass. And the second video covers dispersion, not so long, but deserves its own video. We all like dispersion. And the third video covers absorption. So these guys here show all 3 of those properties, but you mostly see absorption. So if you like pink dragons, let's jump into the first video right now. Transparent and glass-like surfaces get their look or their appearance from quite a few different channels or different factors that come into play. Not least of which is, of course, transparency. So the transparent amount affects the look. The index of refraction, the amount the light rays bend as they pass through material, affects the look. The refraction depth in your render settings, how many bounces you get or how many different surfaces a ray penetrates is going to really affect your look as well. And then there's things like absorption and dispersion and roughness that are all going to affect the look of your glass-like or transparent material. And Octane, V-Ray, and MODO support all of these features, and I'm going to cover all of those features. So this may take a while, which is fine because I am, if nothing, but comprehensive. So starting off with MODO, actually I'm going to go over this scene really quickly. There's a few setup things in Octane that you should refer to the first video. I'm not going to go through them all here, but refer to video number 1. The scene itself has this image as an HDRI. This is the soft tint image, comes with MODO, and that's a nice neutral HDRI that gives some reflections and some nice fill lighting. I also have some area lights in this scene, but I moved them. I moved them over to the side like that. So when you light glass, you need to do a couple of things. You notice the background is much dimmer than in the previous videos, and we need to get some separation between the foreground and the background. Glass lighting also needs to be done generally from the sides or below or above. You typically don't light glass or transparent objects with the typical 3-point lighting system. You can, but typically glass items are lit a little bit differently. And here I've got glass, these bright area lights coming in from the side and getting some reflections and refractions on the edges here to bring a little definition to the dragon. So let's talk about our glass material really quickly. Diffuse amount to 0, similar to metals, right? No diffuse amount in a glass material. Refractive index. So glass can have a refractive index, depending on the type of glass it is, anywhere. It's generally in the area of 1.5 to 1.6, so I have 1.52 here, which is a pretty common refractive index for like a crown glass. Fresnel 100%, which I think should be accurate for glass. Specular color, that's the reflection color, of course, white for this glass. No roughness. Now, MODO, of course, separates refractive roughness and reflective roughness. This is reflective roughness of 0, so sharp reflections on the glass, and a refractive roughness of 0, so no frosted glass look. So we'll get to that later, but that's refractive roughness. No dispersion, no absorption, and a transparent color of white. So there it is, very simple, typical glass material, and that's what you get, that dragon right there. With the area lights on the side, the background is dimmed a little bit, so there is a little bit of separation between the foreground and background. You can see this base here refracted through the dragon's glass base, that dark line. But you really do lose a lot of detail in the dragon's face. You can't really tell what this thing is, so it's not a great looking image. So if, moving forward, we'll look at some of the other channels we can deal with to make this a better looking image, but let's just see how Octane and V-Ray deal with this standard glass material in MODO. Okay, so I'm going to be doing some time-lapse rendering on this on the MODO side, because even with 16 cores, MODO rendering dispersion or refractive roughness is going to be very slow. Octane and V-Ray RT GPU are actually fast enough to do this live, even with really rough refractions and multiple bounces. Moving along, we've got 8 bounces of refractive bounces and reflective bounces in MODO and 2 GI bounces. Same thing for V-Ray RT here, 8 trace depth, that's reflection and refractive bounces, or I don't know if bounces is the correct word, that'll penetrate up to 8 surfaces, and GI depth of 2, so 2 bounces there for GI depth, similar to MODO. So I'm just going to hit go, and we'll see if V-Ray can translate that MODO material I just showed you on the fly into a V-Ray equivalent material. Alright, so hit go in the GPU renderer here, loads the scene into the GPU, converts that material, and starts to render here in 1 second. There it is. So V-Ray always has a sort of really dispersive effect when it starts rendering transparent materials, but then it quickly, in sort of another pass, jumps to the correct transparency there. And it's looking to be very similar to MODO with a couple of differences. You'll notice that it's, in general, the highlights here, and I'll just let that continue to resolve. The highlights in VRay are a little brighter than the highlights in MODO. So if you look at this tail here, this bright white spot on the tail, not so bright in MODO. Bright white here, not so bright in MODO. Bright white here, not quite white in MODO. Same with the ball and the face in general. So something's going on in VRay that's different than MODO. But in general, it looks pretty similar. It's a good translation, a good on-the-fly translation of that glass material. Just one other note. I know I say this in all the videos, but people watch these out of order. VRay RT GPU is not getting the depth of field correct in this particular video. You have blurry up in the foreground, sharp in the background, where both Octane and MODO have correctly depth of field out of focus in the background and sharp in the foreground. So if you notice that, you have a good eye. Anyway. Moving on, before I go over to Octane, I'm going to jump back to... No, actually, let's show Octane, then I'm going to jump back to MODO and take a look at these brightness issues first, okay? So I'm going to stop this so I don't explode my computer when I fire this up. So again, this computer is 16 cores, 2 Xeon 8-core Xeon systems, Xeon processors in the system. GPU-wise, an original Titan and a Maxwell generation Tesla. So pretty decent GPU speeds, but they are a couple generations behind. Even then, it's still extremely fast. So you can see how Octane just in a couple of seconds, you've got it there, right? So again, looks pretty similar to VRay and different than MODO in that the bright areas are very bright. Whereas in MODO, you know, these aren't quite full white here, and it looks generally kind of dim. So let's figure out what's going on with that. The other thing I will mention is that Octane defaults to 24 bounces on the specular depth, or 20 ray with 24 surfaces it can intersect on the specular depth, and 8 on the diffuse. That's a lot more. That's 3 times as many as either VRay or MODO, and that's the default, right? Whoops. And you'll notice something right off the bat, that this dark line here, right here, which is the refraction of the base, it's not visible at all in Octane. So why is that? What's going on? It seems a little weird. In general, it's kind of brighter all around. There's some grays in here in VRay and some grays in here in MODO. It's all gone. It's all been refracted out in Octane. And the reason for that is the increased number of the refraction depth of 24 versus 8. And so if I pause that just to demonstrate and look at the, let's grab my render region and just do this middle section of the dragon here. If I turn this down to 8, and again, I'm just trying to showcase that a number of factors come into play when dealing with refractive or transparent surfaces. And the specular depth or reflection and refraction depth in other programs, trace depth in VRay, is a big deal. So I turn that to 8, so it's similar to both VRay and Octane, and then hit go. You'll notice it's remarkably different. And you see that line coming in there now, similar to these two, and it's a lot dimmer. May even look better to some degree in that there's more definition because there's a little bit more of a darkness in there. Just maybe not as accurate. But, you know, that, so again, let me just go ahead and get rid of the entire render region so you can see the whole thing. So again, that plays a big part of the look, so keep that in mind. So again, that's looking a little bit more like VRay there than it did previously. And if I bump that back up to, keep your eye down here on this dark line, if I bump this thing back up, more bounces, more bounces, more bounces, back to the default of 24 bounces, we just lose that altogether. So something to keep in mind when you are trying to achieve an artistic look rather than trying to be as accurate as you possibly can. Okay, so back to MODO. Why is this so dim? Why is MODO so dim? I don't understand why MODO is so dim. And let's take a look at our item list and our item properties. I'm going to select one of these area lights, and we'll take a look at the area light properties over here in item properties. And there's a little tag called visible to refraction rays. This is off by default. This is not on by default. It is off by default. So if you might imagine what might happen if I turn this guy on both of these, I'm going to turn that on. Okay, so let's do a little before and after here. This is before turning on visible to refraction rays for the area lights, and this is after. So When it's after, again, before, after. When it's after, you notice that it's much more like the VRay and Octane renders. You get the bright highlights here, here, along here. So if you're using MODO and you want those area lights to be visible in refractions, make sure you have the area light selected and visible to refraction rays checked, because it is not that by default. Okay, so there's that. There's a basic glass material. So let's move forward. We still have to deal with absorption and dispersion and roughness. So let's take a look at roughness first. And so adjusting roughness is going to give a frosted glass look. So if I go over here to the dragon, select the glass. Now remember, MODO has roughness in two different places. Specular roughness there deals with reflections, and refractive roughness with refractions. So we want them both. We try to make this physically accurate or as physically accurate as possible. So we're going to put 25%. In fact, let's just do a little bit less, 15%. A little roughness goes a long way, especially with refraction. 15% in both, and then I'm going to do another time-lapse render and take a look at what that does to the MODO renderer. All right, there is a frosted glass look in MODO with reflection and refraction roughness, and it's a really cool look. I love the look of frosted glass and 3D renderers. I love the soft, rough, refractive look. It's very computationally expensive, especially for MODO in particular. This seems to be a bit of a render killer. But it looks great, and in fact, the actual piece of art here, if you want to call it that, looks better. I think the details of the dragon are, come off the background a little more with a little bit of roughness thrown there. So let's see how this translates over to VRay and Octane. First of all, will these settings translate on the fly to VRay and Octane? Will it pick up that refractive roughness value in MODO? Now we know that they pick up reflection roughness from the other videos we've done in this series, particularly the metallic video number 3. Let's see if it picks up refractive roughness. So I'm just going to go over here to VRay, and because this is GPU, you don't have to time lapse this. It could just do it. So let me hit go. Loads up the geometry, translates all the materials, starts up VRay, and it's going to kick in. Now, I always count that first few seconds as part of render time, by the way, when you're thinking about it. That's part of render time. Although it usually caches that stuff for an animation, and you don't have to do that every single frame. Okay, so here we got it, and it is looking to me like VRay does not pick up the refraction roughness settings. We still have basically a very clear 100% glossiness in VRay speak refraction setting. So it is getting reflection roughness. Some of the reflections are a little bit rough here, but the refractions, this line here, is exactly the same. Where in MODO, it really does look like it's behind a bit of a volume there. It really looks like it's being disturbed by the roughness of the refractive rays. All right, so VRay, we're gonna have to dig into the VRay material to figure out how to create this look, and we will do that in a second. First, I'm going to show Octane. So stop VRay, so my computer does not explode on me, and let's fire up Octane over here. And boom, so Octane, so a couple things. First of all, I didn't turn on my Octane polygons, which simulate the area lights. So this is with no polygons there, which is fine. So let's see how this kicks in. Let's see how these polygons affect the scene. This should be fun. But basically, it does pick up that refraction roughness setting, or at least it picks up the roughness setting, because in Octane, as you'll see in 1 second, it only has one sort of roughness control versus VRay and MODO, which separate roughness for both reflective and refractive rays. So that is helping Octane translate that MODO material. And again, let me just get this out of the way. Roughness does not translate perfectly between renderers, right? These are different roughness scales. These are different algorithms. These are very different renderers. This roughness setting in MODO, which is at 15%, looks like this in Octane, quite a bit rougher. So that translation, they're doing their best translating that MODO roughness channel to an Octane roughness channel, but it looks a little too rough to me. So we'll jump in there and change that. But before I do that, let's take a look and see what happens when I turn on the fill light here. So the fill light's coming from this side, and we'll see if how that affects the scene. There it is. And so see, when you're lighting glass, you're basically placing reflections and refractions. And that fill light way off here to the right side in the distance gives us some highlights on the edges of the dragon here, sort of the opposite side of the light, right? Because it's refracting, it's behind the glass dragon, it's refracting in there. So I turn on the key light, same thing's going to happen. Key light's on the left side, but I'm getting this refractive brightness over here, highlighting the edge of the neck of the dragon on the right side of the dragon. So that's how you light glass, just a little tip there. But let's dig into this a little more, right? Because that refraction is a little too much. Let's see what we can do with an Octane override before we go back to the VRay material. So pause this and bring over my item properties. And now remember with Octane, if I add an Octane override in custom materials, it's going to translate this MODO glass material here into a collection of Octane nodes and place those into an assembly. So add that Octane override, custom materials, Octane override, there it is. I can edit that right here in the schematic, edit in schematic. And let's frame this guy up. And here we have what Octane is doing with that material. So it translates MODO's material into an Octane specular material. So it's smart enough to see that MODO has transparency in the material. So it translates this into an Octane specular material versus a glossy material, which we use for plastic and metals and surfaces like that, or diffuse material, which we'll use for subsurface scattering materials in a later video, also for super rough materials like dirt or maybe a rock or something. So it did that correctly. It put it into a specular material, and transmission is essentially the equivalent of MODO's transparent color. So if I look at transmission, we've got a white color in there, but that's being run through an Octane color correction node. I'll get back to this a little bit later when we look at a colored transparency color versus just white. In fact, if I do a render region here on this guy like that, and I just bypass this color correction node by doing this and starting it up here, I don't think we're going to see any difference. And in fact, we don't. There's no difference because gamma correcting white isn't going to do anything. Gamma corrections deal with midtones, not white or black. But we'll get back to this later when we're dealing with a transparency color other than white. So if we tint this guy green or something, we'll take a look at this node again. All right, so that's what Octane is doing. Again, roughness translates differently. So we have a roughness here of 0.09. That is translating that MODO roughness of 15% to 0.09 in Octane, and it's still looking a little bit rough. So again, roughness values are not a one-to-one translation. If I put this to say 0.05 and fire it up here, let's see if we get something a little more MODO-like in Octane. So that's a little bit closer to MODO, maybe even still a bit rougher. But again, remember that this is dealing with more refractive bounces as well. So we see a little bit of that line in here from this guy, but not much. It is a different looking output because the 3 times the number of bounces you have in there for the refraction rays. But that roughness looks a little bit closer. Maybe still a little too rough, but that's all right. You know, we can do a 1-to-1, I guess. Let's turn this to 8 just to see how that looks. And that's looking very similar to MODO there. In fact, I could probably make that a little bit rougher. So I could do this all day, and I'm not going to do this all day, but let's just do 0.09 where it defaulted. Take a look. So actually, you know, Octane, if you look at if you have the same number of refractive bounces, that Octane translation of roughness was pretty close. A little too much maybe, but pretty close. And really, it's pretty granular with roughness values, obviously, as you can see what I'm doing here. When it gets down to it, like a little bit of roughness, 0.09, 0.07, goes a long way with these transparent materials. So, all right, so there is Octane. I think I'm just going to keep, well, I'll just keep that at 8 bounces and specular just to make it sort of more similar to VRay and MODO on this one, but knowing that you can turn it up really high in Octane without really getting any sort of detriment. It doesn't really take that much longer. Okay, so let's take a look at VRay now. So I'm going to pause that. And let's figure out how to create a VRay material to get that rough frosted glass look. Okay, so here's my dragon. I'm going to add a VRay material on the top. VRay materials. Let's do a standard VRay material. Drop it above the Octane override. I'm going to hide both the Octane override and the glass material. I don't necessarily have to do that, but I'm just going to do that to play it safe. Make sure the Octane override is not going to mess with the VRay material. And let's look at our channels here. In fact, I'm just going to fire a VRay, and what we're going to have with a standard VRay material is just a light gray, very diffuse looking dragon. And we need to take that light gray diffuse looking dragon and make it into a frosted glass dragon. So there's our light gray diffuse dragon. And the first thing we're going to do, just like in MODO, is turn our diffuse color to 0. In MODO, there's a diffuse amount in diffuse color. In VRay, it just combines those into one channel here, diffuse color. Turn that to 0. See what happens. And the dragon should go black. And the dragon is black. Okay. BRDF type. If you recall from the metals video, or if you haven't seen it yet, we have a number of BRDF types in VRay. Fong, Blend, Ward, GGX. Ward, I think, was previously used for metals prior to getting GGX to BRDF type. I think GGX is probably a better BRDF type for metals. Blend and Fong are ancient BRDF types, to be honest. They're from the early days of computing. I'm going to stick with Blend as the default for this glass material, and I haven't seen any reason to use Ward or GGX, at least in my Googling around or looking around the Chaos Group forum, so I think you're fine sticking with Blend. Fong's highlights are a little bit sharper, so you can try that if you want to, but I'm just going to stick with Blend here. Reflection color. Remember the reflection color on MODO is white, so we'll go with white. And reflection glossiness. Well, again, this is the opposite of roughness, right? So 1.0 glossiness is like 0 roughness, where 1 full-on roughness is like 0 glossiness. We had a 15% roughness in MODO, so let's try a 0.85 glossiness in VRay. So it'll blur those reflections out a little bit there. And I'm going to lock the Fresnel IOR to the refractive index right here. And so I think in MODO I had 1.52, so we'll turn that to 1.52. We'll keep the Fresnel locked to that. Basically, if I unlock this, I can bump up the Fresnel IOR to something really hot and get some brighter reflections on here. You'll see how that's super bright now because I bumped it up to 40. But we're not going to do that. We'll keep it locked to the Fresnel, to the actual index of refraction down here in the refraction layer. So moving on down, we have refraction glossiness. This is similar to the refraction roughness. It's in MODO, same thing as the reflection glossiness. So again, 0.85. And then we need to adjust the refraction color from black to white, just like the transparent color in MODO. And so let's let that kick in. Boom, I think we're getting there, getting very close. What's cool is VRay can do depth, refraction depth, on a per material basis instead of just going with the render settings. So the render settings, we have it set to 8, max depth 5. I'm not sure if it picks one over the other. My guess is it looks at the material, and if the material's max depth is higher than the actual render settings, say we have render settings at 8, but the material is 24, I don't know if it just uses the 8 as a ceiling, or if it just overrides 8 with whatever this is. I'm going to go ahead and bump that up to 8 though. So we're similar to in both reflection and refraction. So we're similar to where MODO is, and Octane for that matter. And there we go. Now there's some other channels we can work with here. We'll deal with refraction color in a minute. Fog we'll deal with in a second. We're dealing with absorption. We also have some other channels like dispersion, similar to MODO and Octane, so we'll get to those in a minute. So this is what we get when creating a custom frosted glass material using the VRay material. Now, we can't just, again, if you look at the first video, translate that MODO material into an equivalent VRay material. We have to, if we're not happy with the automatic translation of the MODO material, we have to recreate our material from scratch in VRay, unlike Octane, which will translate that MODO material into a set of Octane nodes. Which is fine, though, because the VRay materials offer a ton of different options, and you can quickly get what you want with this GPU renderer feedback in particular. This is a little bit different. Like, I don't notice that black refraction of the base in here. We've lost that, even though in the prior render without the roughness, we definitely had that in VRay. We've kind of lost that now. We have it in Octane over here. And yeah, but other than that, it looks pretty good. In fact, there's more definition in the face of the dragon here than there is either in VRay, or I'm sorry, Octane or MODO. There's just a little more contrast in general in that VRay render. I'm going to pause this real quick. I'm just going to bump up Octane's exposure because I'm just being anal, and it annoys me that this is a little bit dimmer than everything else. So let me bump up the exposure, not the Octane kernel. Let me grab the camera here and just bump up the exposure and the imager just a tad, 0.2, maybe 1.2. So it more matches VRay and MODO. That's probably too much. 1.1. I know how I'm being right now. But there, okay. So let's do a couple before and afters now. Keeping in mind this is not the standard 8 refraction depth or 24 refraction depth in VRay. We've put it all the way down to 8 to be more similar to VRay and MODO. So here we are with rough refractions and rough reflections, for that matter. And here we are with no roughness or 100% glossiness in VRay's case on both reflections and refractions, and then back to rough. So pretty big difference that roughness makes here. Okay, let's move on to absorption and dispersion.
Yum, yum!